Section 7. Towards a biological self? Finally, Dennett also appears to set out on the process of trying to ground the self on a biological foundation by focusing on the biologically necessary boundary between me and not me. Quote, "The birth of reasons was also the birth of boundaries. The boundary between me and the rest of the world, a distinction that even the lowliest amoeba must make in its blind, unknowing way. This minimal proclivity to distinguish self from other in order to protect oneself is the biological self, and even such a simple self is not a concrete thing, but just an abstraction, a principle of organization." End quote. Dennett also, however, points out the ambiguities in this biological foundation. Quote, "The boundaries of a biological self are porous and indefinite. Within the walls of human bodies are many, many interlopers, ranging from bacteria and viruses through microscopic mites that live like cliff dwellers in the ecological niche of our skin and scalp, to larger parasites, horrible tapeworms, for instance. These interlopers are all tiny self-protectors in their own rights. Once something is outside of our bodies, it is no longer quite part of us anymore. It becomes alien and suspicious. It has renounced its citizenship and becomes something to be rejected." End quote. Dennett then questions where the natural biological boundary of the self should be located. He argues that external equipment like shells and internal equipment like resident bacteria should be included. He further argues that other individuals of the same species may be required for a viable self. For example, beavers and termites require teams of individuals to survive in their ecological niches. While all this may be true, what Dennett is doing here is extending and diluting the notion of biological selfhood. Damasio agrees with Dennett as to the necessity of a boundary for selfhood, but Damasio's boundary is much more definite. It effectively guarantees singular individuality based in biology. Quote, "One key to understanding living organisms, from those that are made up of one cell to those that are made up of billions of cells, is the definition of their boundary, the separation between what is in and what is out. The structure of the organism is inside the boundary, and the life of the organism is defined by the maintenance of internal states within the boundary. Singular individuality depends on the boundary." End quote. In other words, as we shall see in coming units, Damasio is saying that while the self is clearly influenced by social relations and the environment, it is nevertheless biologically real. At this point, however, Dennett gives up on any attempt to found the self in biology and reverts to his linguistic, socially constructed account of the self as the center of narrative gravity. Quote, "Our fundamental tactic of self-protection, self-control, and self-definition is not spinning webs or building dams, but telling stories, and more particularly concocting and controlling the story we tell others and ourselves about who we are. And just as spiders don't have to think consciously and deliberately about how to spin their webs, and just as beavers, unlike professional human engineers, do not consciously and deliberately plan the structures they build, we, unlike professional human storytellers, do not consciously and deliberately figure out what narratives to tell and how to tell them. Our tales are spun, but for the most part, we don't spin them. They spin us. Our human consciousness and our narrative selfhood is their product, not their source. These strings or streams of narrative issue forth from us as if from a single source, not just in the obvious physical sense of flowing from just one mouth or one pencil or pen, but in a more subtle sense. Their effect on any audience is to encourage them to posit a unified agents whose words they are, about whom they are. In short, to posit a center of narrative gravity." End quote.